So I'm traveling right now, hence the different background. But either way, let's talk about Highguard, one of the most infamous, high-profile live service releases. Announced back at the Game Awards 2025, it was not met with good reception due to the way it was announced as the big finale at the Game Awards, raising expectations surrounding the game sky high. Apparently, it was supposed to be a game that was going to be shadow dropped, but Jeff Keighley, when he played it, liked it so much that he offered to feature the game at the Game Awards, but that ended up backfiring more than helping the game. And then the game went radio silent for a while. And then just 3 days before launch, we finally saw some marketing and a gameplay overview. And what it turned out to be is this PvP raid shooter is what they call it. It's just a combination of a bunch of genres remixed into, an attempt to make something different. But the end result was that the game was ultimately met with mixed reception, 44% as of the recording of this video. Now, a lot of people did show up at launch due to the general interest surrounding how this game would fare, peaking at over 97,000 players at launch. But that player number very quickly plummeted, losing over 80% in 24 hours and much more throughout the course of the following days and weeks, to the point now where we're seeing 24-hour peaks of just like 2,600 players, which is not good enough to support this free-to-play live service. Now, I'd highly recommend watching this video right here that I published not too long ago. Highguard is already as good as dead, highlighting the most recent development, which was that most developers at Highguard's development studio, Wildlight, got laid off. This is something that developers confirmed via LinkedIn posts when layoffs happened, and also Wildlight came out and issued their own statement confirming that layoffs did in fact happen. All of that is detailed in this video. And Wildlight did emphasize that they still have like a core team who are dedicated to supporting the game, but it just feels like they're ultimately just going to maintain the game rather than make this a full-fledged live service with tons of new content in the coming days, weeks, and months. It feels like this is the beginning of the end for Highguard. As a free-to-play title with not a whole lot of players, it's just not going to make the money that it needs to make supporting the live service and, the recurrent costs involved in maintaining a live service. And Wildlight had a lot riding on this. They're an indie studio who aimed high with this live service, but ultimately, despite coming from developers who worked on Titanfall and Apex Legends, the game ultimately couldn't stand out from the oversaturated market of live services. It wasn't exceptional enough to convince people to play Highguard over all the other games that are out there right now. While the game hasn't been shut down yet, I feel like that's just kind of inevitable at this point. And how that will impact Wildlight remains to be seen, but I can't imagine Wildlight will be in a good financial position after failing to execute on Highguard and make it a profitable business venture. Now, amidst all of this, one of the former developers at Wildlight, Josh Sobel, published the following article on Twitter titled "Reflecting on Shipping My First Game, Highguard." When he worked at Wildlight, Josh Sobel was a tech artist and a rigger, and in this post right here, he expresses his discontent at the way everything played out, blaming gamer culture, blaming content creators, and the way they bashed on the game, expressing his belief that Highguard ultimately wasn't given a chance. And as you'd expect, it's a statement that is ultimately not going down well, with a lot of people spotlighting this as just like an inability to truly reflect on why Highguard actually failed. And so I'd like to take a look at this statement as well as some of the responses we have seen and discuss this developer's take and perspective on things and kind of share my own opinions on everything as well. So here's the full statement. It reads right here: "Apologies for the length. Been wanting to say a lot of this for a while. The day leading to the Game Awards 2025 was among the most exciting of my life. After 2.5 years of passionately working on Highguard, we were ready to reveal it to the world. The future seemed bright. Everyone I knew who had any connection to the team or project had the same sentiments. This is lightning in a bottle. I trust this team wholeheartedly. If there's one project nobody in the industry is worried will fail, it's yours. This has mainstream hit written all over it. There's no way this will flop. I could play this game all day." Now look, there's nothing wrong with being proud of the thing you're working on and having good feelings surrounding it, but living in an echo chamber where everyone's telling you that there's no way, there's no chance that this game will fail is just an exercise in setting yourself up for potential disappointment, because the truth of the matter is that you never know what projects will succeed and what projects will fail. Especially if you're in it, especially when you're part of the team making the project, it's hard to see from the outside in. You can only see from the inside out. You can say you believe you have a pretty good product here, but to try to predict that there is no way something will fail can be construed as potential arrogance, especially for a live service game that has a massive mountain to overcome because of how competitive this particular landscape is. When you're working on such a high-stake project like Highguard that will define the fate of your brand new indie studio, you have to think of every possibility. You have to think of not just why this game can succeed, but what are the reasons that this game could fail, and how do we work towards diminishing those odds? The fact that the team was led to believe that this is the best thing ever and that this is going to be a sure success kind of, I feel like, impeded their ability to look at all of the angles of this game and the potential flaws and pitfalls that may result in Highguard maybe not doing as well as they imagined. Because the thing is, Highguard isn't anywhere near as bad as the internet will make it out to be, but in my opinion, it's also nowhere near as good as some of the biggest supporters and promoters of Highguard made it out to be. As always, the truth always lies somewhere in the middle, and Highguard, while a brave attempt, had a lot of flaws, and it needed a playtest to refine the experience. And instead of hosting a playtest, they decided that they would shadow drop this, believing that there was no reason to ask for player feedback. And all of that stems, I think, from this echo chamber of being told that there's no way this game will flop, that it's pretty much as good as it gets at launch. That, I think, ultimately contributed to the downfall of the game. I think they got a little too cocky in the quality of the title and the tuning that it didn't have and that it needed in order for it to hit harder at launch than it ultimately did. The statement continues, the internal pre-reveal feedback, even from unbiased sources, was quite positive. And where it was negative, it was constructive and often actionable. People who play the game, including us, had a blast, and since we were an independent, self-published studio built with royalties in mind, many of us were hoping this could finally be the thing that broke the millennial financial curse. So they did internal playtests, and the feedback was positive. And that's nice and all, but trust, I've seen many stories of live services or just games in general whose internal feedback was really positive, and then when it hit the masses, the feedback turned out to be harsher than expected. And that's because when you release your game, you have a significantly bigger audience base to really tell you the full range of feedback. The sample size is much bigger, so you just get more accurate results versus doing internal tests where your sample size is ultimately limited. This is not the first time that a developer was taken aback by the disparity between what the internal feedback said versus what the masses said about the game. While internal feedback can be a good indicator, it cannot be the sole relying factor when it comes to determining the fate of a game at launch. You can't just fully trust that because the sample size just isn't going to be realistic to what it's going to be when the game launches. The statement continues, but then the trailer came out and it was all downhill from there. Content creators love to point out the bias in folks who give positive previews after being flown out for an event, but ignore the fact that when their negative-leaning content gets 10 times the engagement of the positive, they've got just as much incentive to lean into a disingenuous direction, whether consciously or not. So now the insinuation is that anyone who did negative coverage of Highguard were biased and did it just for the views. But the thing is, positive coverage, especially for games that are incredibly impactful, also gain tons of views. And a lot of content creators are happy to hype up something that they truly find exceptional. But Highguard just wasn't that. It's not what people wanted out of the developers of, Titanfall. I think the way Highguard was marketed was a massive misstep. Not only was it the big finale at the Game Awards where expectations are sky high, but the big selling point for the game was made by developers of Titanfall and Apex Legends, and you use those brands to try to boost the perception surrounding your game. Except when you come out saying those words from the developers of Titanfall and Apex Legends, there are certain expectations, especially if it's your first game. People thought, oh my gosh, are we going to get a Titanfall spiritual successor? That was the expectation that was set by bringing up those brands. And then beyond that, you went for a genre where there's a lot of skepticism around because of the oversaturation, because of the fatigue surrounding it. And all of that shaped the perception surrounding Highguard. And all those were decisions made by Wildlight Entertainment. Jeff Keighley approached them, but they're the ones who said, yes, let's feature this game as the big finale at the Game Awards 2025, thinking it would go well, when, logically, it was never going to go well doing it that way. Calling gamers and content creators expressing just their honest opinions of the moment disingenuous, when so much of the way the game was received during its marketing phase was a result of decisions made surrounding marketing, I think that right there is more disingenuous, or at the very least, it feels like a bit of denial is at play. Josh then highlights how the hate started immediately. In addition to dogpiling on the trailer, I personally came under fire due to my naivete on Twitter, which almost all of my now former coworkers had learned to avoid during their previous game launches. After setting my Twitter account to private to protect my sanity, many content creators made videos and posts about me and my cowardice, amassing millions of views and inadvertently sending hundreds of angry gamers into my replies. They laughed at me for being proud of the game, told me to get out the McDonald's applications, and mocked me for listing having autism in my bio, which they seemed to think was evidence the game would be woke trash. All of this was very emotionally taxing. Now, that's one area where I think Josh has every right to vent about. I think harassment of any one individual, especially when it's a developer who had no say in the decision-making surrounding Wildlight, a developer who was just doing their job, I don't think that's acceptable. That is not constructive. It doesn't help anyone to go around insulting people instead of providing constructive feedback, dishing out insults and sending threats to developers, especially to those who are not directly responsible for how aspects of the game turned out. That's always something that I've always disapproved of, and I think Josh did not deserve that, no matter what. Nor did any member of the Wildlight Entertainment team. Like, to me, that's just unreasonable and garbage levels of discourse. Josh proceeds to say that there is much constructive criticism that can be and has been said about Highguard's trailer, marketing, and launch, but I don't think it's my place to commentate on that. I also don't think there's any way to know whether the launch would have fared better or worse without the massive spotlight that was thrown onto us in response to the Game Awards trailer placement. But we never got that chance. Honestly, I also can't say for sure if the game would have fared better if it had just shadow dropped instead of being, the big finale of the Game Awards and this game that Jeff Keighley wholeheartedly endorsed. I don't know if going that route would have completely saved the game, because at the end of the day, Highguard is the game that it is, and whether it has the ability to hold people's interest that's solely dependent on the game. But I do think the Game Awards did raise the bar that they had to meet in order to stand out. I think if they would have shadow dropped it, it would have been seen under more humble lights where people would be willing to give more of a chance for it to develop over time. But at the same time, it's as a result of the Game Awards that Highguard got, 100,000 players, almost 100,000 players at launch concurrently playing on Steam. And the fact that the game couldn't retain a significant portion of that player base, I think that says a lot, because ultimately it's a free-to-play game. There's no reason to not stick around if you're genuinely having fun with the title. But the fact that the game dropped off as quickly as it did, I think ultimately highlights a game that didn't hook people to the degree that Highguard developers hoped, and I don't know that aspect would have changed regardless of how it was marketed or announced and whatnot. At the end of the day, the game does speak for itself. Even for my part, when I played Highguard, I, had decent fun with it, but it wasn't so exceptional that I felt the need to go back to it over all of the other games that I have to play. And some people genuinely did love playing Highguard, but clearly that audience is not very high given the current player base and how that player base is constantly diminishing, especially after recent announcements of the layoffs that suggest that Highguard is probably like a dying life service right now. But yeah, Josh presents the notion that Highguard never got a proper chance, how, we were turned into a joke from minute one, largely due to false assumptions about $1 million ad placement, which even prominent journalists soon began to state as fact. But it was quickly reported later on that Jeff Keighley approached the Highguard team about featuring their game as the big finale at the Game Awards for free, so that news did make the rounds. Josh then says within minutes it was decided this game was dead on arrival and creators now had free rage bait content for a month. Every one of our videos on social media got downvoted to hell. Comment sections were flooded with copy-paste meme phrases such as Concord 2 and Titanfall 3 died for this. At launch, we received over 14,000 review bombs from users with less than an hour of playtime. Many didn't even finish the required tutorial. But there were some parallels to Concord in the way that it was received as yet like another hero shooter, and in the way that it's dying very quickly in the way that Concord did, though nowhere near as bad as Concord. But Concord is just such a cautionary tale. And with Highguard, all of the various signs that indicated Concord would be a failure were kind of prominent within Highguard as well, especially because of that marketing flop. As for Titanfall 3 died for this, yeah, that has nothing to do with Wildlight. That's an EA thing, so Titanfall is kind of irrelevant. Though people would have liked to see, Wildlight having developers who worked on Titanfall work on some kind of like Titanfall spiritual successor. I think that would have made a lot of people happy and the game would have attracted a lot more attention. And then in terms of review bombs and all these things, like some argue that, yeah, some of that was unfair. Others argue that, yeah, there are people who just checked out the game for a couple minutes and immediately they were like, this is just not for me. And that they had every right to leave like a negative review if that's what they wanted to do. And then in terms of many didn't even finish the required tutorial. One thing I will say is that I, on day one, tried to play the game and had a lot of trouble completing the tutorial because when I clicked on the tutorial, I kept getting booted out because of server issues at launch. But at the same time, I get that you should play a couple matches before really deciding whether this game has merits or not and like being able to like detail the pros and cons of the title. But the game did eventually go up to mixed reviews on Steam, currently sitting at 44% from over 38,000 reviews. And the thing is, that's not too far off from the mixed reviews we're seeing from critics. On Metacritic, you'll find that the aggregate score for the game from 17 critic reviews is a mixed score of 65%. Eventually, the scores did stabilize, and from both users and critics alike, the final verdict was ultimately that the game was flawed enough that while it tried to go for something different, it couldn't realize the full potential of those ambitions. The game just needed a lot of touching up. The game needed a lot more player feedback. Is the game the 17% overwhelmingly negative review score that we saw at launch? Absolutely not. But I would agree with where the current score sits from my personal experience playing the game. For me, it's in the 6 to 7 range in its current state. And in this current competitive landscape of live services, that just isn't enough to allow you to stand above and beyond the ones that have had years to refine. Josh continues, in discussions online about Highguard, Concord, 2XKO, and such, it is often pointed out by gamers that devs like to blame gamers for their failures and that's silly, as if gamers have no power. But they do. A lot of it. I'm not saying our failure is purely the fault of gamer culture and that the game would have thrived without the negative discourse, but it absolutely played a role. All products are at the whims of the consumers, and the consumers put absurd amounts of effort into slandering Highguard, and it worked. Gamers do have power, absolutely. Consumers do have power, absolutely. The masses ultimately are the ones who give people in certain positions power or the ability to succeed. But there is no grand conspiracy where consumers come together and they're like, okay, what game do we want to make fail and what game do we want to make succeed? All consumers are doing is just genuinely reacting to what they're seeing. And what current consumers are saying is that there is a fatigue surrounding live services and that for you to succeed in that endeavor, for you to really attract our attention when it comes to live services, you have to do something truly exceptional. And Highguard just wasn't that. Also, consumers don't collectively owe you success. You have to earn that. And Highguard tried its best. And I appreciate its effort and what it strived for, but it didn't quite pull it off. It's as simple as that. And it tackled a genre that is incredibly difficult to succeed in and where there's a lot of fatigue around. Even if Highguard tried something new, it didn't push the boundaries to the level that Wildlight thinks the game did. And coming from developers of Titanfall and Apex Legends, again, I think they could have leaned into that for their first game, particularly where Titanfall is concerned, given the demand for a game like that, and given that Titanfall as a series currently, it's been hibernating. So it was the perfect time to make a Titanfall spiritual successor. That would have been the better strategy. Whereas with something like Highguard, you took a tremendous risk, a tremendous bet in tackling a game like this, and unfortunately, it just didn't pay off. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Josh then says that many of Wildlight's former developers will now be forced to assimilate back into the actual corporate industry many gamers accuse Wildlight of being a part of. Now, every time someone thinks about leaving the golden handcuffs behind in favor of making a new multiplayer game the indie way, they'll say, but remember how gamers didn't even give Wildlight a chance. Soon, if this pattern continues, All of that will be left to our corporations, at least in the multiplayer space. Innovation is on life support. So Josh emphasizes here that Wildlight is an independent studio and that this format is better than the current AAA publishers format where, corporate heads make decisions that are detrimental to the potential and the creative autonomy of a game. I do agree with that, but just because you're indie doesn't mean that people have to automatically support you or automatically make you a success or automatically just give you praises. Like, even indie games are bound to the same standards and criticisms as all other video games. Ultimately, it's about, like, am I having fun with this game? Is it addictive? Do I want to keep coming back to it? Obviously, some things are more forgivable when you're an indie studio, but Wildlight, despite being indie, pursued a venture that is often reserved for AAA, a live service that has a lot of costs associated with it that is an incredibly high risk. The fact that mass layoffs happened just 2.5 weeks after launch, after player numbers plummeted, that says everything about how risky a live service is, and that's what Wildlight decided to go for their first game. On one hand, if they succeeded, they would have made tons of money from the get-go, and they would have been set up for the long-term future. But the alternative is that the live service fails in the case of Highguard, which it did, and it just leads to Wildlight as a studio collapsing, and that's what's happening right now. And this notion that gamers didn't even give Wildlight a chance, yes, they did. Highguard kicked things off with almost 100,000 concurrent players on Steam. That's a huge number. That's a great launch. The real issue was that players who checked out the game ultimately weren't compelled enough by it to stay. That's the real story here. It's not that the slander influenced everyone to drop the game, because ultimately, if a game is fun, people will stick around. Not everyone engages with social media online. Oftentimes, the general masses will make their own conclusions and decisions about a game based on their own experiences, and in this scenario, most people quickly left the game after checking it out. Because Highguard does have a steeper learning curve, and its multi-phase gameplay design has some flaws to it, especially that initial looting phase and the capture the flag segment. I didn't find that part to be all that compelling, whereas when you start raiding a base, that's when things kick up a notch. But overall, the way the game flowed didn't feel quite right. The way it was 3v3 didn't feel quite right, though that was quickly addressed with the 5v5 patch. But it didn't start out with that mode, and that immediately put a damper on people's interest in the game. So it was a lot of aspects of the game design, really, that dissuaded people from staying with the game, and less to do with the initial quote-unquote slander surrounding it. But yeah, gamers did give Wildlight a chance, and they will give other interesting-looking multiplayer games, even from indie developers, a chance, but they will express their honest opinions based on what's presented to them and how it's presented to them. And yeah, even indies have to step it up when it comes to making a live service. They can't just make your box standard live service if they want to succeed. Indies are not competing separately from AAA games. As an indie game, you still have to be exceptional, especially if you're doing another hero shooter style experience, because there's so many other experiences that are similar to it that are kind of the standards, the go-tos for that genre. And if you can't surpass those from the outset or show the potential of surpassing them, then you're dead in the water. That's live service for you. The statement closes off with, even if Highguard had a rocky launch, our independent, self-published, dev-led studio full of passionate people just trying to make a fun game with zero AI and zero corporate oversight deserve better than this. We deserve the bare minimum of not having our downfall be gleefully manifested. I do agree that it sucks that some people find joy in the downfall of a game or studio or of individual developers. I want every single game to succeed. That's my hope. I did want Highguard to be good. I did want it to punch above its weight. I did hope that at the end of the day, it lived up to that Game Awards hype. But it didn't. And while, yes, this is an indie studio, yes, the developers were passionate, yes, they genuinely tried to make a fun game, they didn't use AI, there was zero corporate oversight, all those things are admirable, but having those things doesn't mean you deserve success or that you're owed success by the consumers. At the end of the day, consumers care about the end product, and Highguard being, yes, free to play, but monetizing heavily through microtransactions and the progression system being tied to you having to recurrently spend money, you had a certain responsibility for your product to live up to a certain standard. And for consumers who are inundated with live services, Highguard specifically just didn't quite do that, so they naturally just moved on. That's what happened. And that's kind of where the statement ends. The rest of it is just giving thanks to certain people. But yeah, the responses are not being kind to this statement. You can see right here from the 2.1 million views that it got compared to its low 2.1 thousand likes, and the significant amount of responses here, 1.7 thousand responses, that this post is being ratioed pretty heavily. In fact, one of the top posts here with more likes than the original article reads, "Thank you for admitting toxic positivity is indeed a killer. Nothing is stopping every person who likes this tweet from playing and buying the in-app purchases, but it isn't happening." Continues with, "You cry about negativity, but you'll never improve if you don't actually ask why it happened. And you don't want to ask why it happened because then you might cry because, God forbid, someone tells you what was made is unappealing." Here we have somebody talking about the echo chamber that this individual presented through all of these positive sentiments that they got from, folks that they invited to play the game, or, internal testing and whatnot. So here we have Osberg saying, "As a business person, I immediately knew what went wrong when I saw this part of the post. When you have only positive criticism and not hard truths about your games, especially a game where the market is oversaturated, you cannot rely on this type of feedback, which delivers nothing. You're asking friends, family, and close industry people whether they play this game, when you should be asking, can we get 100,000 people to switch from Apex Legends, Marvel Rivals, or Valorant to play our game? There was no validation for that feedback, no alpha, no early access, no public testing. You literally went to launch blind, believing you were immune to failure." That right there, I think, is the real story. I don't celebrate Highguard's failure. It sucks that it failed. It sucks that the developers are going through this. It sucks that Wildlight is in danger of being shut down. But I can see where things went wrong. I can see where they got a little cocky. I can see where the echo chamber kicked in and how that proved to be detrimental. The fact that they were going to shadow drop this without a playtest initially before Jeff Keighley elevated it to, Game Awards finale status, to me, that's wild. To me, that's insane. This individual continues, "On top of all of this, you accepted the prime closing spot on the Game Awards where gamers expected a Game of the Year level announcement with a bland trailer that doesn't even show what your game actually is, followed by weeks of silence, ending that with an out-of-touch streamer event just prior to launch. In my honest opinion, this was one of the worst marketing fails in gaming." I do agree with that. I don't take joy in saying it, but it's true. The marketing was abysmal, and the mentality of there's no way for this game to fail, so we'll just launch it blind, was a massive mistake that cost the game. This concludes with, "I genuinely think that you're right about negative content farming, review bombing, and inexcusable personal attacks, but the failure of this game is not on gamers, but on you. Hopefully on your next projects, you will find people who can tell you the hard truths." I think this statement pretty much summarizes my feelings on this whole situation and this statement that Josh provided. And the thing is, a lot of responses to this statement are incredibly constructive. There are hard, harsh truths, but very constructive, like Osberg here. And then when you look at quote tweets, you'll find plenty of people discussing how they had to learn through failure and how this bubble that they lived in terms of feedback, how this echo chamber was kind of one of the key factors to their demise. This individual put it aptly, "When I went to art school, I thought I was talented. I'd been told so my whole life because I was drawing and painting pretty pictures that looked nice. Then I got there and realized that pretty isn't the same as meaningful. I got my work torn apart, work that I had labored over. My tutors ripped into me because I didn't respect them enough to actually think through my work, and they were right. That was painful, but it was the lesson I needed at the time." The same thing happens in game development right now because people form these bubbles. They think they've nailed it, but then players tell them otherwise. What matters is how you react then. Either retreat into defensiveness and keep making the same mistakes, or actually listen and be willing to learn. Life is short, folks. Being humbled might be uncomfortable for a while, but usually you then get to look back at some point and understand that this was the moment you started to learn something new. Couldn't have put it better myself. Just because you worked really hard on something, you had every good intention, doesn't mean, again, that you're owed success. Doesn't mean that you're owed positive feedback. Doesn't mean the consumers owe you anything. Because at the end of the day, this is a transaction. At the end of the day, consumers are choosing to spend time and money on your product. And so they have every right to decide whether that product is worthy of their valuable time and their valuable money. Some people are quote tweeting Josh Sobel's statement with posts like, "This is the definition of toxic positivity," highlighting the sentiments that, people who are connected to the team or project shared when they play the game. "This is lightning in a bottle. I trust this team wholeheartedly. This has mainstream hit written all over it. There's no way this will flop. I could play this game all day. If there's one project nobody in the industry is worried it will fail, it's yours." It's wild to me that these statements were all they went on. I know it sucks to be in Josh's position. I know that he labored years over this. I know the entire team labored years on Highguard, really believing in it, being really proud of it. And I know the intentions surrounding Highguard were good. But with all said and done, you have to look at the reality of the situation. You have to look at all the reasons that it failed, and they were many. But blaming gamers, blaming content creators who had genuine reactions to what they saw is not how you overcome this, especially for your next project. I hope there are true learnings with Highguard because, from an outside-in perspective, where I'm looking at it, there are a lot of learnings definitely to be had with how it was marketed and how the game was released. Here's another top comment responding to Josh saying, "There's no bigger mystery in game development to me than games that hundreds of people work on for years and nobody can see that they are just bad and stand no chance. Highguard is one such game, and now you have a developer still unable to believe they made a bad game. No, it's the gamer culture that killed it, and the Game Awards, and the rage-baiting YouTubers, not the boring artificial world, not the pseudo-edgy yet generic characters, not the corpo-style UI, not the tired genre." Other folks are highlighting how, despite the article saying that, this individual is reflecting on Highguard, it feels like they haven't actually reflected at all and are just blaming gamers instead of genuinely looking at what happened and what are the reasons, what are the chain of events that resulted in Highguard failing in the way that it did. But yeah, this is kind of my take on Josh Sobel's statement regarding Highguard and his attempt to blame its failure on the discourse surrounding the game instead of the choices made by Wildlight that ultimately led to this result. But that's my take. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on why Highguard failed and Josh Sobel's statement in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.